The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of a missing paramedic. Jackson Cole sat behind the counter of his small gas station on the outskirts of Willow Creek, tapping at his phone while the old TV above the register played the evening news. The anchorwoman was speaking in a clipped, urgent tone. Local authorities have yet to confirm the cause of the violent attacks downtown, but reports indicate. A loud crash outside made Jackson jump. He looked up just in time to see a figure stumble against the glass door. His breath hitched. The man's face was pale, his shirt drenched in blood. His arms flailed weakly, smearing crimson streaks across the glass. Jackson's first instinct was to rush forward, but something held him back. The way the man moved was unnatural. His head lolled forward like his neck couldn't support its weight. His mouth gaped open as if gasping for air, but no words came out. The door chimed as someone else entered, an old customer, Terry, a trucker who made frequent pit stops. "The hell's going on out there?" Terry asked, adjusting his cap. He followed Jackson's gaze and frowned. "Is he drunk?" "I don't think so," Jackson muttered. The man outside suddenly threw himself against the glass with shocking force. A low, guttural moan escaped his lips, sending a shiver down Jackson's spine. Terry stepped closer. "Hey, buddy, you okay?" The man's head snapped toward them, his eyes wild, sunken, empty. Then, with a horrible snarl, he lunged, slamming against the glass so hard that cracks splintered across the surface. "Jesus!" Jackson stumbled back, fumbling for his phone. Before he could dial 911, a police siren wailed down the road. A squad car screeched to a stop outside. Two officers leaped out, one holding a baton, the other with a hand on her holster. "Step away from the glass," the male officer barked. But the bloodied man didn't respond. Instead, he threw himself at the window again, and this time, the glass gave way. The body crashed into the store, landing hard on the linoleum floor. Before anyone could react, he scrambled to his feet, moving with an unnatural, jerky speed. His mouth opened wide, revealing bloody teeth, and he lunged. The female officer screamed as the thing tackled her, its teeth sinking into her neck with a sickening crunch. Gunfire erupted, 3 shots, then 4, but the creature didn't stop. It only paused, its head jerking back unnaturally as bullets ripped through it. Then, as if nothing had happened, it continued gnawing. Jackson's stomach churned. The second officer backed up, eyes wide in horror. "What the hell?" Terry grabbed Jackson's arm. "We need to go. Now." Jackson barely processed the words before more figures emerged outside, men, women, some limping, others running. They all had the same empty, hungry eyes. The officer's radio crackled. A panicked voice shouted, "They're everywhere. It's spreading. The hospital, oh, God." Then came static. The officer turned to them. "Get in the back. Lock the doors." Jackson and Terry didn't hesitate. They sprinted toward the storeroom as the glass door shattered completely, unleashing the horde. Screams filled the station. And just like that, the fall of Willow Creek had begun. Jackson slammed the storeroom door shut, his hands trembling as he twisted the lock. Outside, chaos erupted, the inhuman groans of the dead, the sharp cracks of gunfire, the screams of people being torn apart. Terry stood beside him, chest heaving. "This is bad," he muttered. "Real bad." Jackson's mind raced. What the hell was happening? One second, it was a normal evening, the next, the world had flipped upside down. A guttural snarl from the other side of the door sent a chill down his spine. The creatures had followed them. Something heavy slammed against the door. Once. Twice. The flimsy wood wouldn't hold for long. "We can't stay here," Jackson whispered. Terry nodded. "There's a back exit." They moved fast, pushing through stacks of boxes until they reached the rear door. Jackson twisted the handle, locked. His hands fumbled for the keys, but Terry didn't wait. With a grunt, he kicked the door hard. Once. Twice. The third time, it burst open, revealing a dark alley filled with dumpsters and abandoned crates. Jackson barely had time to take a breath before they heard it, a chorus of low moans from the street beyond. "Oh, hell," Terry muttered. Shambling figures clogged the alley entrance, their dead eyes locking onto them. The nearest one, a woman in a torn business suit, let out a hungry snarl and lunged forward. Jackson reacted on instinct, grabbing a nearby tire iron and swinging with everything he had. The impact sent the woman sprawling, but she barely hesitated before scrambling back to her feet. "They don't go down easy," Terry warned, pulling a hunting knife from his belt. More of them pushed into the alley, closing the distance fast. "Run!" Jackson shouted. They bolted down the alley, weaving through obstacles. The creatures were fast, faster than they should have been. One of them, a man in a hospital gown, lunged at Terry, fingers clawing at his jacket. Terry didn't hesitate, he drove the knife into the thing's skull, right between the eyes. The creature twitched, then collapsed. Jackson gaped. That worked? "Gotta hit the brain," Terry panted. "Now keep moving." They reached the street and froze. Willow Creek was gone. Fires raged in the distance, black smoke curling into the night sky. Cars lay abandoned, some still running, their doors flung open. Bodies, both the dead and the undead, littered the sidewalks. People screamed as they ran, only to be dragged down by the things that used to be their neighbors. Sirens wailed, but they were distant, scattered. The city's emergency response had already begun to collapse. Jackson's breath came in ragged gasps. "Where do we go?" Terry scanned the street. "We need to get out of the city. Fast." A car screeched around the corner, nearly hitting them. The driver, a woman with wild eyes, barely noticed as she plowed straight through a group of the undead. "Think she's got the right idea," Terry muttered. A gunshot rang out nearby. They turned to see the police officer from the gas station limping toward them, his uniform torn, his arm bleeding. He fired another round at an approaching zombie, but the thing barely staggered. "Help!" he shouted. Jackson hesitated, but Terry didn't. He rushed forward, stabbing the nearest zombie in the head before grabbing the officer's uninjured arm. "We need to move!" Terry yelled. A fresh wave of the undead spilled into the street. Jackson knew then, this wasn't just a bad night. This was the end of everything. And it had only just begun. Jackson, Terry, and the wounded police officer sprinted through the burning streets of Willow Creek, their breaths ragged, their eyes darting in every direction for an escape. The officer groaned, clutching his bleeding arm. I'm not gonna make it," he panted. "Shut up and keep moving," Terry snapped. "You stop, you die." Jackson's heart pounded as they turned a corner and skidded to a halt. The street ahead was a nightmare. Dozens of the undead clogged the road, shuffling, twitching, waiting. And they had just been seen. The creatures' empty eyes locked onto them, and in eerie unison, their mouths open with hungry snarls. The groans rose in volume, a horrifying signal that rippled through the horde. "Back! Back!" Jackson shouted. They spun, but the way they had come was no better. More of the creatures were pouring in, closing off their escape. Trapped. Terry's grip on his knife tightened. "Find an open door." "Anything." Jackson's eyes darted along the buildings. Most shops had their shutters down, doors locked. But one, an old hardware store, had its door slightly ajar. "There." Jackson pointed. They dashed toward it, Terry reaching it first and shoving the door open. They stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind them just as the first zombie crashed into it. The officer collapsed against the wall, panting. This isn't real." "It's real," Terry growled, shoving a nearby shelf in front of the door as the undead outside pounded against it. "And it's only gonna get worse." Jackson's hands trembled as he grabbed a crowbar from a nearby rack. The store was dimly lit, stocked with tools, gardening equipment, and, yes, a locked glass case filled with hunting rifles. "Bingo," Jackson muttered, moving toward it. Terry followed, his gaze sharpening. "We need those." The officer coughed. "Keys, owner might have 'em, upstairs, used to be an apartment above this place." Jackson nodded. "I'll check." Terry shot him a look. "Be quick. We don't have time for screw-ups." Jackson moved toward the stairs, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. The door at the top was closed, but something about it made his stomach twist. There were deep scratches on the wood, as if someone had clawed at it desperately. He swallowed hard and turned the knob. It was unlocked. The smell hit him first, rotting flesh. He barely had time to react before something lunged from the darkness. A figure, once human, now something else, slammed into him, knocking him back against the railing. It was a man, his face sunken and torn, his eyes hollow pits of hunger. Jackson barely managed to shove his crowbar between them as the creature snapped its bloody teeth inches from his throat. "Jackson!" Terry's voice echoed from below. Jackson gritted his teeth and swung. The crowbar connected with the zombie's skull, sending it reeling. Jackson didn't hesitate, he swung again, harder this time. The thing crumpled, its body twitching before falling still. Jackson panted, staring at the mess he'd made. His hands were shaking, but he forced himself to move. Stepping over the corpse, he searched the apartment. It was ransacked, signs of struggle everywhere. He spotted the store owner's body slumped near the couch, throat ripped open. And next to him, a keyring. Snatching it up, Jackson bolted back downstairs. Terry's expression darkened as he saw the blood on Jackson's clothes but didn't ask questions. "The keys," Jackson panted, holding them up. Terry grabbed them, rushed to the gun case, and unlocked it. "Now we're talking." The officer, still pale and sweating, stared as Terry loaded a shotgun. "You think those will stop them?" Terry pumped the shotgun. "Only one way to find out." The barricade at the door shuddered. The undead were pushing harder, their snarls growing louder. Jackson tightened his grip on the crowbar, knowing this was just the beginning. There was no safe haven. Not anymore. The wooden barricade trembled as the dead outside pushed harder. The guttural moans grew louder, pressing against the door in a horrifying chorus of hunger. Terry slung a shotgun over his shoulder, tossing a rifle to Jackson. "You ever shot one of these before?" Jackson caught it, feeling the weight of the weapon in his hands. "No, but I guess I'll learn fast." The wounded officer groaned from his spot against the wall. His face had gone pale, his breaths coming in sharp gasps. You need to leave me," he muttered. "Like hell we do," Jackson snapped. But Terry wasn't looking at the officer, he was looking at his arm. The bite. Jackson felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. The wound was worse than he realized. The flesh around it had already started to turn an unnatural shade of gray, veins darkening beneath the skin. Terry's jaw tightened. "We need to be realistic." "No," Jackson shook his head. "We can." The barricade cracked. The door buckled inward as rotten fingers clawed through the gaps. "Not the time." Terry barked, raising the shotgun. The door exploded inward, and the dead poured in. Jackson barely had time to react before Terry fired the first shot. The blast tore through the lead zombie's chest, sending it crashing into the others. But they didn't stop. They never stopped. Jackson aimed his rifle, hands shaking, and pulled the trigger. The shot hit a zombie in the shoulder, barely slowing it down. "Headshots!" Terry yelled. "Only way to drop 'em." Jackson adjusted his aim and fired again. This time, the bullet punched through a zombie's skull, splattering the wall with blackened gore. The creature crumpled instantly. Terry grinned. "There you go." But for every zombie that fell, more pushed forward. The officer groaned, struggling to stand. His body trembled violently, sweat pouring down his face. "Terry," Jackson started, but he didn't need to say it. The officer was changing. His breathing hitched. His pupils dilated. His fingers twitched, convulsing. He looked up at them and snarled. Terry didn't hesitate. He raised the shotgun and fired. The officer's body hit the floor, unmoving. Jackson clenched his teeth. No time to think. No time to grieve. Because the dead kept coming. Upstairs! Terry shouted. We need the high ground. Jackson didn't argue. They sprinted up the stairs as the horde crashed through the store, knocking over shelves, tearing through whatever stood in their way. Reaching the second floor, Terry slammed the door shut behind them. There's a fire escape, Jackson panted, pointing toward the window. Terry nodded. Go. I'll hold them. Jackson hesitated. Terry, no. Terry shoved a fresh shell into the shotgun. We both know I ain't getting out of here alive. He forced a smirk. Least let me go out with a bang. Jackson's throat tightened. Then, boom. The door downstairs shattered open, and the horde surged forward. Terry looked back at Jackson. Go! Jackson cursed and bolted for the fire escape, throwing the window open. The metal creaked beneath his weight as he climbed out. Inside, Terry roared as he fired, again and again. The deafening blasts echoed through the night. Then, silence. Jackson clenched his jaw, forcing himself to keep moving. The city was lost. The streets below writhed with the undead, fires raging in the distance. Willow Creek had fallen. And Jackson was on his own. Jackson's breath came in ragged gasps as he climbed down the fire escape, every metal step groaning beneath his weight. The sounds of the undead swarming the hardware store filled his ears, snarls, crashing shelves, the final echo of Terry's last stand. And then, silence. A sickening dread settled in Jackson's gut. He didn't need to see it to know. Terry was gone. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to keep moving. Morning could come later, if there even was a later. The fire escape ended a story above the ground, forcing Jackson to drop the rest of the way. He landed hard on the pavement, knees buckling, but managed to roll and push himself up. Then he saw the street. The city was unrecognizable. Fires burned wildly, casting eerie shadows across the crumbling buildings. The roads were clogged with wrecked cars, their horns blaring uselessly into the chaos. Bodies, some human, some not, were strewn everywhere. And the dead were still hunting. Jackson crouched behind a burned-out sedan, gripping his rifle tightly. The undead weren't moving aimlessly anymore. They were hunting in groups now, their milky eyes scanning the streets, searching. A scream rang out in the distance. Not a zombie, a survivor. Jackson whipped his head toward the sound. Down the street, a young woman was sprinting for her life, her blonde hair matted with blood. Behind her, at least a dozen zombies were in pursuit, their jerky movements faster than they should have been. She wasn't going to make it. Jackson acted before he could think. He raised his rifle, exhaled sharply, and fired. The lead zombie's head snapped back as the bullet punched through its skull. The others barely hesitated, but Jackson was already taking another shot. "Over here," he yelled. The woman's terrified eyes locked onto him, and without a second thought, she veered in his direction. Jackson fired again. Another zombie dropped, but there were too many. "Move," he shouted as she reached him. They darted into a nearby alley, Jackson slamming the metal gate behind them shut. He jammed a dumpster in front of it, but it wouldn't hold for long. Panting, the woman collapsed against the brick wall, clutching a knife with trembling fingers. Who the hell are you?" she gasped. "Jackson." He wiped the sweat from his brow. "You?" "Ellie," she panted, still catching her breath. Jackson peeked through the gaps in the gate. The zombies outside weren't leaving. They pressed against the metal, their fingers clawing, their moans growing in volume. "We can't stay here," Ellie whispered. "No kidding," Jackson muttered. Ellie's hands shook as she red-dripped her knife. "I was with a group. We were trying to get out of the city." But then, her voice hitched. She didn't need to finish. Jackson already knew how the story ended. "Any idea where we can go?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. There's an evacuation point. City Hall. The military was setting up a perimeter there, at least, that's what we heard before everything collapsed. Jackson's stomach twisted. The military. If anyone had a chance of surviving this mess, it was them. It was a long shot, but it was something. A metallic clang made both of them flinch. The zombies were getting more aggressive, slamming their bodies against the gate. Ellie met Jackson's gaze. We move. Now. Jackson took one last look at the horde, then nodded. City Hall was their only hope. And they had to survive long enough to reach it. Jackson and Ellie moved quickly through the alley, careful not to make a sound. The city had become a graveyard, the streets littered with wreckage, bodies, and the constant presence of the undead. City Hall is about a mile from here, Ellie whispered. If the military's still there, we might have a chance. Jackson gripped his rifle tighter. Big if. Ellie didn't argue. She knew the odds were slim. They reached the alley's end and peeked around the corner. The street ahead was a nightmare, burning cars, abandoned stores, and bodies sprawled across the pavement. Some were unmoving. Others twitched. Jackson scanned the area. We go fast and quiet. Keep low. Ellie nodded, and they slipped onto the street, weaving between vehicles. The smell of death was thick, but Jackson forced himself to focus. Halfway down the block, Ellie suddenly stopped, eyes wide. Jackson followed her gaze, and his blood ran cold. A military convoy sat in the middle of the street. 3 Humvees, doors open, gear scattered across the ground. The soldiers were gone. Or worse. Jackson crouched behind a wrecked police cruiser, motioning for Ellie to follow. Something went down here, he muttered. Ellie crept forward, peering into one of the Humvees. Blood was smeared across the seats. Bullet casings littered the ground. Then Jackson saw it, movement. Near the convoy, a soldier lay slumped against a car, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. His uniform was stained with blood, his assault rifle lying limp at his side. He's alive, Jackson whispered. Ellie hesitated. It could be a trap. Jackson didn't argue. It could be. But if there was a chance this guy knew what happened at City Hall, they had to take it. Carefully, they approached. The soldier's eyes fluttered open, and for a split second, fear flashed across his face. Then his gaze focused. Help, he rasped. Ellie crouched beside him, checking his wounds. A deep gash ran across his side, but he hadn't been bitten. What happened here? Jackson asked. The soldier coughed weakly. City Hall, compromised. Jackson's stomach sank. The evacuation failed? The soldier nodded. Overrun, we were retreating, ambush, his breathing hitched. The dead are getting smarter. Ellie's face paled. What do you mean? The soldier tried to sit up, but his strength failed. Not just mindless anymore, they're learning, setting traps, his voice dropped to a whisper. They're waiting for us. A deep chill settled over Jackson. If the soldier was right, then this wasn't just an outbreak. This was an evolution. The soldier's hand weakly gripped Jackson's arm. Kill me. Jackson stiffened. What? I won't make it, the soldier wheezed. You can't carry me, and I won't slow you down. Do it before. A moan echoed through the street. Jackson's grip tightened on his rifle as the dead began to stir. The bodies littering the ground, the ones they assumed were corpses, weren't corpses at all. One by one, they twitched, their limbs jerking unnaturally. Then, in eerie unison, they turned their heads toward Jackson and Ellie. Ellie sucked in a breath. Oh, no. Then they lunged. Run. Jackson shouted. Ellie didn't hesitate. She grabbed the soldier's rifle, then bolted. Jackson took one last look at the wounded man. His eyes were pleading. I'm sorry. Then he turned and ran. The road to City Hall had just become a death trap. And the dead were waiting. Jackson and Ellie sprinted down the ruined street, the sound of the dead chasing them like a rising tide of horror. The soldiers' words echoed in Jackson's mind. They're learning. They're setting traps. The horde behind them wasn't just a chaotic mess of shambling corpses. They were coordinated. Ellie pointed ahead. Cut through there. They darted between two collapsed buildings into a narrow alley, weaving past overturned dumpsters and debris. Jackson's heart pounded as he risked a glance back. The zombies didn't hesitate. They followed without breaking stride. They knew exactly where they were going. A sickening realization gripped Jackson. They'd been herded here. Ellie, stop, he gasped. She turned just in time to see what he did, a chain-link fence, towering high, blocking the exit. Trapped. No, 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 Ellie whispered, turning back. The first of the zombies rounded the corner. Jackson raised his rifle, firing a clean shot into the lead zombie's skull. It dropped, but the others didn't slow down. Ellie yanked open a nearby dumpster. Up! Now! Jackson didn't argue. He boosted Ellie up first, then hauled himself inside. The smell was revolting, rotting food, blood, decay. Outside, the horde swarmed the alley, searching. Jackson and Ellie pressed against the metal walls, holding their breath as the dead shuffled just inches away. A long, agonizing moment passed. Then, one of them stopped. Sniffed the air. Jackson's blood went cold. That wasn't normal. Ellie's eyes widened in horror. They could smell them. The creature turned toward the dumpster, lips peeling back in a grotesque grin. Then it reached out and began to lift the lid. Jackson reacted instantly. He grabbed his knife and stabbed the creature's hand to the lid, pinning it in place. The zombie let out a shriek, thrashing wildly. Ellie kicked the dumpster lid open, knocking it off balance, and Jackson finished the job with a rifle butt to the skull. The zombie collapsed. But the others had heard. We have to move. Ellie yelled. Jackson climbed out and spotted an old fire escape hanging overhead. Without thinking, he cupped his hands. Jump! Ellie didn't hesitate. She ran, stepped into his hands, and leapt, grabbing the rusted railing just as the dead surged forward. Jackson followed, barely grabbing on before they tore at his legs. A cold hand snagged his ankle. Ellie grabbed him, pulling hard. Come on! With a final wrench, Jackson broke free, scrambling onto the platform just as the horde slammed against the wall below. Panting, Ellie looked out over the city. We can't keep running like this. They're too smart. Jackson exhaled, his grip tightening on the railing. Then we stop running. Ellie looked at him in disbelief. And do what? Die? No, Jackson's eyes burned with determination. We fight. City Hall was close. If they had any chance of surviving, it would be there. But something told him the worst was yet to come. Jackson and Ellie moved fast across the rooftops, jumping between buildings as the dead filled the streets below. The closer they got to City Hall, the louder the gunfire became. That meant someone was still alive. We need to get inside before they get overrun, Ellie panted. Jackson spotted an old maintenance ladder on the side of a building leading down into an alley. That's our way down. One by one, they climbed down and sprinted towards City Hall, staying low behind burned-out cars. The once grand building stood in the middle of a ruined plaza, its steps littered with bodies. Barricades had been smashed apart, military vehicles overturned. The stronghold had already fallen. The last of the soldiers fought near the entrance, holding their ground against a massive horde. They fired relentlessly, mowing down the dead, but they were outnumbered. Jackson turned to Ellie. We get inside. If there's an escape plan, it's in there. She nodded, gripping her stolen rifle. Let's move. They sprinted across the plaza, using the gunfire as cover. Jackson dropped 2 zombies in their path, clearing the way. A soldier spotted them and waved them forward. Hurry, the man shouted. They reached the steps just as the barricades collapsed. the horde surged forward. Inside, now, the soldier ordered, shoving them through the doors. Jackson barely had time to register his surroundings. The grand lobby was a mess of overturned desks, empty supply crates, and blood-stained walls. A handful of survivors, civilians, a few wounded soldiers, huddled inside. An older officer stepped forward. "Who the hell are you?" Jackson caught his breath. "People who want to live." The officer grimaced. "You picked the wrong place. Evac failed, no more airlifts. We're on our own." Ellie's face hardened. "Then what's the plan?" The officer hesitated. He didn't have one. Outside, the gunfire stopped. Silence. Then came the slow, rhythmic pounding on the doors. The dead were here. A younger soldier cursed under his breath. "This is it." Jackson looked around. They had weapons, ammo, but no exit. "There's gotta be another way." "There isn't," the officer said bitterly. Ellie's hands tightened around her rifle. "Then we fight." The pounding grew louder. The survivors braced themselves. And then, the doors exploded open. The dead flooded in like a tidal wave. Jackson fired. Ellie screamed as she emptied her rifle into the horde. The soldiers fought valiantly, cutting down the first wave, but it wasn't enough. One by one, they fell. Ellie grabbed Jackson's arm, pulling him toward the stairwell. "We have to get higher." They dashed up the steps as the survivors below were overwhelmed. Gunfire turned to screams. The lobby became a feeding ground. They reached the top floor, bursting onto the rooftop. Jackson scanned the city. No choppers. No rescue. Just the end. Ellie stared in horror as the dead poured onto the roof. "This is it," she whispered. Jackson clenched his fists. No. He wouldn't go out like this. Then, a sound. A distant rumble. Ellie gasped. "Look!" A convoy roared through the city, heavily armed military trucks. Someone had survived. A loudspeaker crackled to life. "This is Fire Team Omega. Survivors, hold your position." Jackson's chest tightened. They had one chance. He turned to Ellie. "You ready?" She took his hand, eyes burning with determination. "Let's go." And together, they leapt into the fight for their lives.